All right. I think so. We'll find out. Going to call the meeting to order. All those that can, please stand for Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. All right. No, I'm not prepared. Okay, let's see here. Okay, roll call, please.
All board members are present except for Mrs. Cooper, who sends her regrets. They're not starting yet. They're starting at 6:45.
Or later.
Ish.
Ish, yeah, we're ishing it tonight. All right, so
You want roll call for the planning commission?
not yet.
Okay.
We'll get you there. All right. I keep looking that way and it's all the wrong people. So we need an approval of the agenda. Okay, use your mics, please.
Sharing.
Say, Joe, go ahead.
Motion to approve the agenda, Salvia.
Support. Okay, moved and supported. Vote, please.
Clerk Flowers votes yes. Mrs. Frederick? Yes. Mr. Salvia?
Salvia, yes.
Mr. Howe?
Yes.
Mrs. Lewis? Yes. Mr. Hamill?
Hamill, yes.
Motion carries.
All right, consent agenda approval.
Motion to move to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Support.
Okay, moved and supported. The vote, please.
Ms. Frederick?
Yes.
Mr. Salvia?
Salvia, yes.
Mr. Howe?
Yes.
Mrs. Lewis?
Yes.
Mr. Hamill?
Hamill, yes.
Motion carries.
All right.
Jess, by the way.
Any announcements? All right, we'll move on. No announcements. Public comment. Anybody have public comment? Scott, can you grab that microphone right there? Well, we need to record it. That's the.
No, I just wanted to commend the board for this building. I think that it better represents our community, compared to our old building. So it's really, this is very nice facility, and the bathrooms are always very clean. It's very well maintained. Be nice to see a couple of bushes up front, but something alive in front of it. But no, it's a beautiful facility, and it's turned out very nice. So that's all I wanted to say.
All right, thank you. Need to get that back over there. So, all right. Any other public comment? No. All right, we'll move on. New business.
Actually, I do real quick, if you don't mind.
Okay.
There's a thing, just real quick, there's I'm gonna go back to our safe routes to schools that we did, I don't know, Jenny, whatever year that was, and we put that crosswalk at Milford High School and changed all that. There was a post on Facebook, Brian Salyers, who's a teacher and coach at Milford High School. And they were all excited. It was last day of school. And I see the kids were all lined up with their bikes to go across the street. And I made a comment. I go, it's nice to see it being used. And the comment back was, I'm paraphrasing now, but basically how happy they are they can cross the Milford Road with that crosswalk for that area over there. So I thought that was pretty cool. It's been quite a few years since we've done that, way back, but it's definitely really paid off for that area, for those that had subdivision across the street, for those kids to be able to ride their bikes to school and things like that. So that was really cool. So, yep.
Sorry, I had to go on a tour. Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. All right, we'll move on to new business. Resolution 24-22. Where are you? Okay, this is in response to the retirement of GFL Environmental from the waste disposal service. What's that? I'm not projecting that. That's Beth is in control. That's for later. So anyways, what's happened is GFL has sold itself to Priority Waste, lock, stock, and barrel, everything. Trucks, the whole works. Residential only, yeah.
So, one of our attorneys attended a meeting held at, I don't know, some big initial name of Oakland County local. Oh, is it not on?
I'll pull it up to you.
So we were able to get a little bit more information that you might find helpful. A lot of our communities have a provision in your contract with GFL that says they have to get prior consent before they can transfer, which is why GFL is asking for these letters to be returned to them by June 25th, because they intend to close on it on June 30th with Priority. The meeting that was held was with Priority and some local government officials in Oakland County. And what they learned from that is that Priority is purchasing 400 trucks from GFL and hiring almost all of the GFL residential waste drivers and staff. They're taking over 73 municipalities, including the city of Detroit. I understand that the GFL trucks are currently being equipped with Priority's cameras. They have cameras all over the trucks so that they could go back and look if there's any issues, and so that there's ongoing monitoring for any issues that might be happening at the time. The trucks are going to be upgraded, repainted, and rebranded over time, not immediately. They do not, Priority does not intend to replace the waste and recycle bins. And as of right now, as far as transferring the current contract, they're not providing new cans, but those can be negotiated in a future contract. He did indicate, Priority indicated that there was going to be some speed, there are going to be bumps in the road, but they're hopeful that everything, the transition should be, all the bumps will be corrected within 90 days. So the resolution that you have in front of you, we've added just some protections. So we're asking that we don't want to reopen the contracts to allow for any negotiation. We want to keep them locked into the contract, but we've indicated that they have to provide us the certificate of insurance that GFL had to provide us when we had the contract, as well as contact information so that we know if any of the notice provisions of the contract require us to provide notice, we know who that person is and the address. That's it.
Okay, so Joellen told me that there was language that basically says that all of the conditions in our current contract with GFL shall be met. Okay, so I want to just throw in something here because somebody might hear this. We've been getting a million calls, not really that many, but a lot. And many of them asking for refunds. And I want to make the comment that it's $180 a year. You get 3 different pickups available to you, which equals about $1.15 per pickup, which is less than the cost of 1 bag for compost. You can put out as many bags as you want. You'll pick up anything GFL does at this time, anything that you put out there. I can't understand how somebody could complain about $3.50 of a week. So I'd like to see them try and throw the trash in their car, and what it cost them to drive to a dump site would be a lot more than $3.50 for 1 bag of trash. So I know they probably aren't paying attention that it's an assessment, not a tax, and they're probably not looking at the individual assessment and realizing it's $180, but people get pretty hot over, ketchup on a burger that they asked not to be on there. So it's about equal to that. So the general population has been very good about it. And I have to say that I appreciate the fact that 7,500 people haven't come in and jumped down our throats. I have had threats of, I'm still looking for it to happen, trash being thrown in my front yard. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but we'll find out. So.
Can I make a comment? I think the part of the problem is too, of course, we know this, that they've been so good. They really have. I think our garbage collection's been great. And now there's a hiccup, and I don't think people, I think our job is, and I do the best I can to promote and let people know. I think we're all doing it, but just make sure we keep educating that, it's going to be a little hiccup here, and you got to realize, I'm sorry you didn't get picked up on Friday or Saturday or Sunday. Maybe they'll come Monday. And it's hard now because it stinks so much too. It's so hot out, but as long as we can keep educating, I think, and we'll get through this. It's easier for me to say because I'm not here dealing with this. You guys are in the office, but I know I try to monitor on Highland Matters and on Facebook and stuff and try to tell people it's going to be all right. But it's hard, but yeah, $180 is amazing. Thanks.
All right. So, I'll get this thing rolling here. I'm going to make the motion that we approve resolution number 24-22, consenting to the assignment of its waste hauling services agreement from GFL Environmental to Priority Waste LLC.
Support.
Okay, moved and supported. Any discussion on that? I'm pretty sure it's going to have some hiccups, but we'll get around it. I don't think somebody earning minimum wage could hold the garbage can out for that price to the street. I mean, so it's kind of like, okay, or whatever, but all right, vote please.
Mr. Salvia,
Salvia, yes.
Mr. Howe,
Yes.
Mrs. Lewis.
Yes.
Clerk Flowers votes yes. Mrs. Frederick,
Yes.
Mr. Hamel.
Hamel, yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, the next item. Do I need to get approval to sign that? Okay, good. So is that it? Nothing more? This is disappointing. Okay. On that note, meeting adjourned. Next. Okay, Roscoe.
I guess we'll start with roll call, Roscoe.
Grant Charlock, Kevin Curtis, Chris Hine,
Here.
Mike O'Leary, Scott Temple,
Here.
Russ Tierney, Guy York, here. Roscoe Smith here. Okay. Okay.
Roll call for the board, please.
Do I have to do it your way? All board members are present except for Mrs. Cooper.
Chris, if you could announce the call to the public.
Agenda number 1, call to public, opportunity for anyone to bring forward any issues, interests, or concern for the Planning Commission, Board of Trustees. Consideration. Each participant limited to 3 minutes. No one? Okay. So next, we're here to talk about agenda number 2, the training opportunity on land use approval process presented by the township planning consultant, Megan Masson Minnock of Carlisle Wortman Associates, and township attorney, Lisa Hamill. Come on, I'm sorry. Rosati Schultz, Chopstick, and Butcher. Some tough names there, but yeah, so that's agenda number 2, and we'll get going.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. My name is Megan Masson-Minnock. I'm with Carlisle Wortman Associates. We're your planning consultants. Many of you have probably met my colleague Doug Luan before. In the past year, he's stepped down in his role at Carlisle Wortman and no longer goes to night meetings. I'm a little envious, but also happy to be here and happy to meet those of you who I haven't before. Also with me is your township attorney, Lisa Hamame, who I've also had the pleasure of working with in the city of Berkeley, where she is a planning commissioner.
No.
Okay. So we were asked to come here tonight to do a training on special land uses, specifically because you have a lot of special land use cases coming before the 2 bodies the Planning Commission recommends and the Township Board approves. So we wanted to spend some time tonight of going over what makes a special land use special. Also to talk about some procedural things as well at the end, and we'll have breaks for questions, but would appreciate also if you have to stop us anytime, if you have questions or items for discussion, especially if you think of a case that you've had before in the past and you're wondering how this applies, or a specific instance that you think might come up. And again, you're curious about how this is being applied or would be applied. So being planners and lawyers, we want to go back to the beginning and ground you in what the statutory authority is. First is the Michigan Zoning and Labeling Act, and that's Public Act 110 of 2006. And for those of you who like your MCL numbers, they're there. But it's also your Charter Township of Highland zoning ordinance is the statutory authority. So those are where those come from. And we're going to dive in the next couple of minutes about each one.
I will add that the statutory authority is not very helpful. It basically says that you establish the standards and you have to apply your standards. And so that's why you have standards, and we're going to spend a good majority of the time today talking about your standards and what you should be considering, what you should be thinking about, what you shouldn't be thinking about, just to help you apply those standards.
Lisa, can I ask you a legal question though? Okay. In the Michigan Zoning and Enabling Act, it says a public hearing notice is required when a discretionary decision is part of the special land use. Could you talk a little bit more about what a discretionary decision is and why it's different than an administrative decision?
Sure. I mean, obviously, as attorneys, we don't like the word discretion. And the reason we don't like the word discretion is if you have unfettered discretion, you have an opportunity there for selective enforcement, unequal treatment. And you don't want that. You don't want that because even if you're not, it could be pieced together that you are because it's discretionary. every time you see a situation where there's discretionary decisions, there's always going to be factors, special land uses, variance, anything where you get to decide and it's not just black and white. You're going to have standards just like you have in the zoning ordinance for special land uses. And Megan and I talked about how this was going to be presented. And we decided that it's so much more beneficial if this is more of a discussion versus us just reading to you. Everything you need is actually in the PowerPoint. And so maybe when we go through, again, I want to emphasize, I think it's very helpful if you have questions. There is not a dumb question, because if you have the question, others are having it and maybe just afraid to ask it. So please stop us along the way and we'll walk you through it.
So could you, I'm sorry, am I not talking in the mic? I guess I got to get closer to me. So could you explain why it's so important that we consistently apply our ordinances?
It really does come back down to fair treatment and providing due process.
So it opens up us to liability if we're not basing our decisions based on our ordinances that we've written, and it could look like there's a bias from one person to the next, right? Which would open us up for some liability issues. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Sorry, right? Even that's pretty hard, right? We've got language in front of us oftentimes that Beth or somebody else provides. And out of 11 of us, we can come up with 11 different interpretations, which perhaps doesn't mean the same thing as the word earlier today, the one that you lawyers don't like. Discretion, right? So still happens, I guess, a bit. How do you get on the same page with regard to interpretation? I don't know.
So one of the things in order to make sure you're treating everybody fairly is to use what's in your zoning ordinance and to keep that nearby when you're making those decisions. And so special land uses are listed in each zoning district. The Planning Commission, when that decision comes through, the Planning Commission makes a recommendation and the Township Board makes the final decision. The standards for approval are in section 603H, and we'll go through those in a bit. The process and supporting materials are in section 603 and 602. And really the way that affects you as decision makers is when an application gets to you, all those supporting materials should be there. That you should have all of the materials and all the information that you need in order to make the decision based on those standards. A public hearing with notice is required at the Planning Commission and the Township Board level, and that's in your ordinance. Planning Commission recommends and the Township Board tables, approves with conditions, or denies. So when you're having these at the Planning Commission level, it's important to emphasize to both to the applicant and to the public that the Planning Commission is a recommending body, and the final decision is going to the Township Board. Are there any? Oh,
I do think it's important to point out, because I think there were questions at the last meeting about who applies these standards. And so I think it's important to spend a little bit of time on this. Both bodies are deliberating and essentially deciding, except that one body is merely deciding on a recommendation to the township board. In the end, the standard is the standard is the standard. So both bodies should be applying the standard. Now, if the planning commission went through every factor, then the meeting minutes would say, this is the first factor, and this was all the discussion under the first factor, and these are the people who feel it's all been met or hasn't all been met. And then you go through every factor that way, and a decision is made as far as a recommendation, whether all the factors have been met or not. That's all being presented to the township board with your recommendation, and the township board can agree with your analysis and your decision, or they might not. In the end, it's the township board's decision. So even if you say it should be approved based on these factors, when it gets to the township board, they may not agree and they may decline to accept your recommendation.
Do you find that a lot of planning commissions use those factors as a checklist and actually go through them?
I will tell you, and this is a decision of administration, but I will tell you in most of the communities that I work in, the planning consultant actually prepares a full-on report. That report says, this is what it's zoned. This is what's allowed. These are the adjacent zoning districts. This is what the master plan says. These are the standards that you have to apply this. And they go through every standard and they give you their opinion as to whether or not that standard is met.
And sometimes, as the person who's drafted those letters, sometimes it's the standard we feel is met. The standard could be met if these things happen, or that the standard has not been met as it's proposed. And those letters are routinely anywhere between 10 to 20 pages based on how complicated it is, how complicated the case is itself. And those letters, you should also, if it's associated with a site plan, being letters from your township engineer. I had some communities where the township attorney also weighs in on special land uses and rezonings in one community, even site plans. And then those letters become part of the written record.
What about outside authorities that would be able to kind of set some of those ordinances? So I guess I'm thinking, and I may not have this right, Lisa, you can help me out here, but the Farmers Act, the GAT, I think it's the Gantt Act or something like that. So, you know, they're allowed certain things. Does that supersede the township?
So there are specific laws that do supersede or supersede the local authority. The Right to Farm Act, which you mentioned, is one of them, with the generally accepted agricultural management practices that are set by the state. There's another one that was recently enacted about extraction. There was one about extraction, and then there's one that's recently about renewable energy that can supersede local control in certain circumstances. So in those instances, you might have a special land use, but those actually may have different standards based on those state acts. And so these can get complicated in those specific instances.
If the ordinance is drafted properly, then you shouldn't have that conflict if you're looking at a special land use for a particular issue. But if you do ultimately have an issue where state law governs, it's going to be brought to your attention or maybe even not presented to you for that reason. I think there's enough layers between staff, consultants, applicants, engineers, that it would have been caught before it gets to you.
You know, as time goes on, different things happen, right? So now, you know, we have legalized marijuana. And that was a use that maybe was not put in our ordinances. It may be there now. I don't know. I've been kind of disconnected for the last couple of years. But if an item comes up and it becomes a special use, or, you know, who determines that? The township determines that, and how do you make sure that that's an all-inclusive list?
So the township board approves the zoning ordinance with the recommendation of the planning commission. And that's any amendment. So for instance, with this recent renewable energy state law, PA 233 of 2023, if you chose to amend your ordinance in order to comply with that, then the planning commission would, you would ask staff and your lawyers, maybe your planning consultant, to help draft ordinance amendments. Those would come to the planning commission. They would look at them. I've seen your planning commission at work. They look at these things very seriously and go through word by word, and then they make a recommendation to the township board. So really the township board's the final stop in terms of whether something's a special land use or not, just in general. And then when you come to that decision in particular for a special land use on a particular site, again, it's the planning commission recommending to the township board.
So going back to my question, I'm relatively new to the board, or to the commission. I find, Beth, that your narratives in introduction to items that we're reviewing are very helpful, and they're brief and they're to the point. You don't go through that checklist, and it would appear to me that maybe that's a practice we may want to consider changing in our planning commission. Do you consult with Carlisle Wortman on a case-by-case basis?
I don't necessarily consult with them every time.
Good.
And the reason why you have not gotten the in-depth reports that have been described by Megan and Lisa is that a former chair took great exception to having so much put on paper before him, and it became kind of an agreement amongst the planning commissioners at the time that they didn't want to see that and substitute someone else's decision making and discretion. And not discretion, that's not the word. They didn't want to substitute somebody else's analysis for theirs. So we can bring Carlisle Wortman on every single report. I can still do a brief one if it's helpful to you. We could do both.
As many of you know, I sat on the Wixom Planning Commission for a long time, and our consultant did exactly what council just said, and it was very helpful. And I'm aware that other communities don't do that. Maybe they do it for fiscal reasons. Maybe they do it for the reasons that you cite. And I don't know how I feel about it. I don't know what council suggests. Is it a bad habit to be in, or is it acceptable habit to be in? To want to do it on your own as opposed to paying a consultant?
Well, I think we spent many years with basically our own in-house counsel, if you will, right? We all know that. And that's how we operated for a long time. And Beth's exactly right. That seemed to be the direction it was going. But what I was going to ask earlier, or actually second what you just said, when I heard, I think Lisa, right? When I heard her talking about that checklist, I thought to myself, that really is something we don't often do. I hear you try to bring it in from time to time when we're discussing an issue, but I really like that idea as well. Let's, stick to the road. I think it would be a bit more equitable in terms of what we agreed upon and come up with from an interpretation standpoint. So I like it. And I just wanted to make sure we said that. And not to get too far down the road into a civics lesson, but I thought it was really interesting when you talked about the process and how and what we should do in the checklist and what that brings. And you talked about the different places you see and folks you deal with. In Highland, we lean pretty daggum heavy in a certain direction politically. So a majority of folks out here oftentimes think the same. Here in Highland or in other communities, once it leaves the planning commission where it should be based on ordinances and codes and interpretations, what often or sometimes happens when it gets to those elected officials? I know you said it shouldn't, it still should be the equitable treatment, yada, yada. It almost sounds though like we're excluding politics and our leaders are elected. So I know how it goes here. I've lived here a long time. I agree with how it goes here. I'm just wondering, there's got to be politics involved once it leaves. And that's why I think it's really important we follow that checklist, because other things can happen. And we've had not a lot. We've had some of our recommendations not agreed with. I won't say that's the way I'll say it. But yeah, just how does it go politically when you're dealing with some of those?
So if you're applying the standards properly, politics should not play into the decision that's made. I'm going to add a little caveat here in that we all think differently. We all have different interpretations, as you indicated. The intent of having the report in front of you is really to guide you. You may disagree with that report. You may disagree. Planning Commission might disagree with the report. Township Board might disagree with Planning Commission. As long as your analysis has been documented in meeting minutes where it can be defended. Well, they said let me just give you an example. Megan writes a report and tells you these standards have all been met and here's why they've all been met. Then it comes to the Planning Commission and the Planning Commission looks at one standard and says, yeah, I don't think it's been met. And here's why I think the planning consultant has got this wrong. And they establish the reasons why on the record. Well, then when it goes to city council or township board might very well say, no, I think her analysis was pretty right on and we're going to side with her analysis. Does that complicate things for litigation? Sure, but it's defensible because you've had the deliberation, you've thought it through, you've applied the analysis as best you could, and you've reached a decision. So the report is really meant to offer a guide, not to substitute your opinion.
And one other thought for you guys.
Yep.
It's not a cost savings measure to not have the consultant write the report. Those costs are passed through to the applicant. They're the third party costs that we collect an escrow from at the very beginning. You're always entitled to ask for the reports that you think you need to do your job. So that don't let that enter into your thought process.
The if the applicant is unsatisfied with the decision the board makes on a particular item, what is the next step? Is it straight into litigation or does it go to the ZBA or?
It goes to litigation.
So I got to comment on, the last event that we're engaged in. And I think
if you're going to talk about specific cases,
I'm going to talk about a process.
Okay.
I think the process of having the list, land use standards, was never clearly defined to the board at any point in time. None of us knew to ask. And that's the way I feel. I was never really clearly defined. When I'm looking through the packets, I look at that and I go, okay, and I didn't feel that anybody did anything wrong. I just think that there should have been, this is a good opportunity now, looking forward, emphasis is on better read these things, from a different perspective or more clearly before you get stuck in front of a crowd going, like I did. I don't ever want to have that happen again. I would much prefer to have our paid consultant to be the one that presents that information forward. It's fine. It's better to have information to start with to be able to hammer it than it is to try and hammer it all out at the table. And it was the wrong place to try and hammer something out at the board table. So this is why we've called this meeting, is to learn this process. So I think because there are more special land uses that appear to be coming up, this is a pretty important thing. I don't want to see that happen again. It should be a smooth operation. Should have been easy to, the one thing I think that really caught me off guard, and I'm always one to be picky about it, is reading should, shall, may, those key words. And when that shall came in there, it was like, oh, this is not the kind of vote that I think I'm going to be required to give. So I really appreciate this interaction. So that's all I got to say about it.
I agree 100%. I want to just reiterate on that too. I agree 100%. We started to vote, and it's like, I've never dealt with that before, where you had to vote for something, but the way it was all worded, and I'm again not blaming anybody either, but just very frustrated because I've been 3 terms on this board. We've never done anything like that before that I remember, and that's why we're kind of. I remember Judy and I are looking at each other like, "What are we doing?" It just was very. Again, I'm glad we're doing this too. I mean, it's important to know that we want to be on the same page. At least we know what we're dealing with.
So back to the standards. So if you take one thing to print out and put in your materials that you bring to every meeting, it would be this slide, because it has all 7 standards. But Lisa and I are going to unpack them one by one. And again, this should be a discussion, so feel free to ask questions, etc. To have a discussion. So the first one is all special land uses shall, and again, shall is must, be designed, located, planned, and operated so that the public health, safety, and welfare will be protected. And again, some of those in terms of looking at those, that decision of whether that public health, safety, and welfare will be protected, that could be seen as a discretionary decision, because you're each going to approach that with your own lens. Lisa, did you want to chime in on anything else on that?
I think that very first one is a key element, because if I'll use a future thing, say there's a entity that's wants to locate where the old lumberyard is, and it has facilities that generate product or sell product that are known to be hazardous to one's health based on science. And it's really difficult to say, there's quite a few people that would disagree and say that there's no way you can protect somebody from some of those elements. Of course, is that a standard that would make it so that none of these facilities could get built because you can't prove that it's completely safe or the health and welfare, so those words are really just so broad that it's difficult to even make that one fall true right from the get-go. So number one is like, that don't work.
I kind of almost want to know what you're talking about. I mean, it could be cigarettes, it could be cheeseburgers, it could be marijuana, right? But yeah, I think that's a great point. Shall for the protected. Okay. All right. Well, what authority, not the planning commission, I guess it's for you guys, right? How can you do that if something has already been deemed by a higher authority as legal? Where does that come in?
So again, this is where you have to use your discretion and then also look at it on a case-by-case basis. There's a lot of verbs in there: designed, located, planned, and operated. So some things that are an industrial use that would, without filters or scrubbers, give off noxious gases, and that could be would be harmful to the general public. If they are operated with those scrubbers and whatnot, then the standard possibly could be met. So that's why you're using your discretion in each one, and that's why you're asking detail in each instance. And also, sometimes perfection is the enemy of good. And so I would hope that you would look at each of these standards with an open mind and know that you would be applying them to each instance that came before you. And health, safety, and welfare, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, that comes directly from the police powers given to municipalities by the US Constitution. So that's where that really broad language comes from.
It's the only reason that we can even exist is because it's our job by law to protect the health, safety, and welfare. And you can spend based on those same three things. That's it. I mean, there's no more detail involved in that. So any decision we make has to be based on, are we protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public? Man, you could write books on it. Yeah, so I think that's why it's going to be key to, let's let our professionals write this stuff. We can tweak maybe some of the elements or add to it, but at least if it comes to me, I can look at it and go, somebody with a little more time at their hands and knowledge is going to be helping to direct me. And I'm not saying, Beth, you're not doing that, but because you give us a tremendous amount of help. But I think that it kind of takes it out of, it's an arm's length.
Well, there's a balance to that too, right? I mean, they might be smarter than me, and you are, of course, but I voted for you. So, so yeah, I hear what you're saying, and it's good to have professional advice, but this is our community. You know.
Right, but but you can use that as the tool to be able to tailor it to us, as opposed to. But if we have to sit down and write the answer to this every single time, it's one of those things where you sit there and go, oh, when I had to read that, I was like, oh my God, I can't answer these questions. That's why we didn't act on it.
So if I can chime in a little bit on this, just using Megan's example about an industrial use. The zoning ordinance that has been reviewed and drafted and approved by both Planning Commission and the Township Board has already taken into consideration certain uses and where it can and can't be, where it should and shouldn't be. Where you're at right now with special land uses is that gray area. There's a reason they're special. They're not necessarily appropriate in residential districts and industrial districts and commercial districts, but they may be depending on that particular use, which is why you're looking at it individually based on each application that's in front of you. If you're looking at a particular use that's allowed in a district, it's because a determination's already been made that for the most part, generally speaking, it would not offend the public health, safety, and welfare.
Turned it off. Okay, I'll do it. Should I do it again? All special land uses shall be compatible and harmonious with the surrounding land uses, taking into consideration the size, location, and character of the proposed special land use within the context of the surrounding land uses and the master plan. Furthermore, the proposed special land use shall not cause substantial injury to the value of the property in the area in which it's located. So there are really three things in there. One is that it's harmonious in terms of the surrounding area, the surrounding land uses. 2, the master plan. And then 3, that it shouldn't cause substantial injury, or you could say the devaluation of property in the area in which it's located. So, and then the master plan becomes important, looking at not only what the future land use says, the future land use map, which the Planning Commission's in the process of updating, but also the goals and objectives and anything that the master plan might say about that particular property. So and that's why it's important to look at not only the surrounding land uses, but also what the master plan says and what the existing zoning says.
So if we have a Kirby's Coney Island on one corner and a Leo's Coney Island on a second, And now National wants to come in and put one on the third corner. Do we make the decision that there could be substantial injury to the property of the other two?
It can't be financial.
What does that mean, value to the other property, if it's not financial?
If your house
Is
is worth, X value, and a use comes in that deteriorates the cost, let's say your house is worth $500,000.
It doesn't say house, it just says property.
Well, it could be whatever. I was just using house as a,
Okay.
as a.
I'd like
I mean,
to answer.
Yeah,
Yeah, it doesn't mean injurious to another business enterprise. It means injurious to a property. So I can't think of an example.
To the land.
So it would have to, the decision would have to do an injury to the value of the property so that it couldn't be used in a reasonable way for any of the other uses in the zoning district. So for your example, somebody could argue that, hey, I own Kirby's, and I might come to you during the public hearing and say, this is going to hurt my business. And are you going to compensate me? And really it's not that it's to the business or it's to a financial end, because also when you're looking at other land use decisions, you don't use the financials of a business to make those decisions. What it is whether it's everything that you could possibly do with that property, has that been devalued? And so again, you're looking at different things.
I'm sitting here trying to think of an example.
You're talking about if someone has a residence behind that property and that's going to devalue the house when you put a business right in front
Yeah,
of
if they have, say, for example, and I don't want to use the word composting because it could be right to farm, but let's assume someone's composting leaves. It's not protected under the Right to Farm Act. That would be the use. And would that devalue a neighboring property owner because someone's out there doing essentially an industrial use? Yes, it would devalue that property. It's not about business competition. It's about affecting somebody's ability to live in that house or do whatever, or if it's a business, to conduct their business.
The irony was that comment about devaluing this. I would argue that through assessing, it's not going to happen. You're not going to see the values go down. They're going to stay where they're at. They're going to go up. So, and that's what it's based on, is that kind of value. So to make the comments or have people make comments, it's going to devalue my property. Guarantee you it won't, because assessing is not going to let that happen. And that's a weird way of looking at it, but that is, I mean, I've looked at scenarios where I've said, why are these people paying so much in taxes? Anything we can do? No, you can't. And there's state law to back that up. So the whole it's decreasing my value thing would literally have to be something that would make it unable to be able to live, health, safety, and welfare. So it's really the first one does that. So the valuation is not really going to, doesn't work, you know?
Yeah, I was wondering if I could just ask a question regarding that. So kind of on the other side of the coin, what if you had, like, for instance, 4 Coney Islands that all wanted to occupy one of 4 corners in a township? The potential for one of those 4 to go bankrupt would be very high. So then what you would end up with would be a vacant building, which would be an eyesore. Maybe you couldn't repurpose it. So how can that, the potential for something like that be factored into a decision-making process, or should it be?
So in that case, and if you're looking at an oversaturation of uses, that really is better dealt with at the master plan level, to say at particular areas or corners, we've noticed that could be a concentration of this particular use. And when I first started out in planning in the 1990s, it was drugstores. because they were looking to locate on every corner and in particular areas. And then many municipalities were looking not to grant the special land uses for the drive-throughs at the time. But really what they found is that they couldn't if they were applying the standards correctly. And especially if you had allowed another one previously. But if you go back to your master plan, you're looking at certain areas and saying, we're looking for not have an oversaturation of uses in a particular area that generates a certain amount of traffic, such as a drive-through for a drugstore, then that's something where using this standard, you can go to Act 2 and say, that links to what's said in the master plan. And that's a standard rather than the oversaturation of uses in terms of the substantial injury is a much farther leap.
I think it's important to revisit this standard in the context of the standard, right? So this standard essentially is saying that the special land use shall be compatible and harmonious with the surrounding land uses. And then it goes into giving you more detail to help you analyze it. And it ends with, furthermore, the proposed special land use shall not cause substantial injury to the value of the property. Well, what's substantial injury? What does that mean to you? What does it mean to the Planning Commission? It may be different than what that means to a person living next door to this use, but does that mean it's a substantial injury? They may feel it's a substantial injury because they're right next door, but it may not be in terms of compatibility with the surrounding neighbors.
Well, there you get back to a couple of questions where we're here to help us educate us in how to equitably apply the standards. And as I read this one in particular, H2, right? There are those three basic points, concepts here, but this is really where we're supposed to be doing our job. This is a standard. The standard isn't or doesn't go into lengthy definition, but the word shall is thrown in there a couple of times, right? So case in point, Beth does a great job. She brought this with us a few months back for a very interesting discussion we had at a public meeting. And, you know, we needed, and I don't know that we've done that a lot, Beth, but it was wonderful. And it did help when you brought that in and said, hey, you all need to read this before we get here. And we need to make sure we're doing some of these things in the application of a decision or a recommendation, excuse me. But when it gets to that, isn't that our job? And what Rick appoints those of us for and what we vote for these guys for. So the third one, when it talks about injury to the value of a property. Well, I might think very differently than my partner does, right? And of course, the members of the board might think, but that's our job, right? And that's what I'm trying to get to, what you're helping me to understand, right? I need to follow the standard, but then we still have to understand, interpret, and apply it in a way that makes sense to us. And that's not always going to be something we all agree upon, right?
Correct. It may not be something that you all agree upon. There may be votes where it is 5-2.
But it could be defensible, to your point earlier, Lisa, right? I view the standard as saying I see a decision that I can stand behind and make based on the fact that I believe this is injurious to that property.
And I think the fact that you have a different opinion than your brethren on Planning Commission and City Council, I keep calling you City Council, I don't know why, Township Board. And I think that is why deliberations at the meeting on each of these standards is important, because you're going to have, let's just assume you have a report from your planning consultant that says there's no substantial injury here, and here's why. Then you can debate that and discuss that among your commission and decide whether you agree or disagree or have a different opinion. But as long as all of that's in the record for you to reach your decision, the key when I'm in court defending your decision is, did you base your decision on competent material and substantial evidence on the record? On the record being what was said, what's in your meeting minutes. As long as you debated it, and you reached a decision and we could defend that based on what your opinion is, then it's fine.
So the thing that I see here with this stuff is generally this is all business related, because these things tend to be related not necessarily to residential so much as they do to commercial business. And one of the things I see happening is that there's people who spent their life working for someone else, and there's people who spent their life making jobs for someone else. So there's different perspectives of how people see the application of these guidelines and rules. I was self-employed and hired a tremendous number of people and made a lot of people have a good life from that. And so I tend to look at business as a tool that none of us would be here today without a business. So for me, and a lot of times, most of the time, the decision-making tends to be based on, we have nothing if we didn't have businesses. So I need to look at it from a perspective of the business and the viability of the business that may be asking the questions, or can I do this? So when somebody comes against me to defend these things, I look at it from a different perspective. And then I know that there's others who are residentially oriented and will tend to look at it from that perspective. So it's a tough thing to try and describe, but the reality is we're talking about business here in almost all these cases. All these cases are that way.
In some of those cases, if you look at your residential zoning districts, some of them, your special land uses are adult daycare centers, adult daycare homes, bed and breakfasts. Now those are all businesses. Boat launching facilities for residential development when operated as a private club. So it could be a nonprofit, or it could be something that's just with the subdivision. Cemeteries, which is an institutional use, group child care centers, group day child care homes. Institutional use is small scale, which is usually churches, schools, etc. And municipal parks, playgrounds, and other recreational facilities are special land uses. And so those could be operated by government, by private, by public. So you definitely
remember, that does not mean it's not a business.
No, nonprofit doesn't mean that it's not a business, but
they're all businesses, every single one of them. They just don't pay tax. And so we are looking at primarily business related situations that require a special use, because we're trying to insert them into a residential non-business environment. That's what it all boils down to in every single one of those cases. You're either a church can locate in a place where some other business can't. It's still there, producing revenue, generating lots of parking spaces, lots of traffic, all the things that a business does. As long as it's a profit of any kind or nonprofit, it's a business, period. A farm is a business. So when I look at these things, that's the way I have to look at it, because it's usually something against a business. So a business wants to insert itself in a place where it generally wouldn't be allowed, but there's a special use for that. So it's a business. And that's usually where the discussion comes, where people start butting heads on stuff, is I don't want that in my yard. Well, they don't want a business in their yard. They don't want a business in their subdivision. They don't want a business in their neighborhood. So I think that's the way we have to look at these standards. You're putting them against, is a business viable? And that's what these standards are about, because otherwise residential gets an awful lot of things that are based on the local zoning. So
I just want to emphasize that the standards are about the township and the township making judgments, and you as elected officials and appointed officials making judgments as to whether they meet those standards, such as being compatible or harmonious. So, are we in a place where
you can
move on to the next one? Okay. So, the land use shall be in general agreement with the proposed master plan designation for the area where the use is proposed. So that's your future land use plan. And really whether that use matches up with what's said in the future land use plan. The zoning may not always match the future land use. And there may be instances where you're looking for something to change. And so to have that special land use might be not further the goals of the township as articulated in the master plan. Any questions or discussion about that?
Yeah, I have one. The master plan is one of the things that keeps getting tossed in our face over and over again. And I don't look at a master plan as a static document. I look at it as a living document. And most of the general public looks at it as a static absolute, and it can't vary. Yet we vary it all the time because it's our job to see that we change with time, and that's why the master plan changes. So I think it's key that when somebody starts to question the master plan, that they be educated. It's a living, changing document.
I would agree with you that it's a living document, and that also in state law and case law, there's room for municipalities to make decisions that are counter to the master plan when you document how circumstances have changed since the time when the master plan was adopted. And so if you were in that situation, a response on this standard could be the situation has changed a lot since that time. And this is how. And so, but you're updating your master plan right now. And so it's important then when this master plan is, as the planning commission is looking at it, and then when they make a recommendation to the township board, it really matches what your vision is for your community. And then also gives instructions into how those circumstances might change, and that you regularly update that master plan once every 5 years.
I find it interesting that this standard says shall be in general agreement with the master plan. So it doesn't say it absolutely has to be in strict conformance with the master plan, which is what the words I would use if I was requiring it. And I think the reason for that has to be that you really only visit your master plan every 5 years, and surroundings change, people change. And so I think that, as Megan indicated, as long as when you're going through this factor, you address the master plan, whether it meets the master plan or it may not meet the master plan, but the area has changed to this degree that we feel it's compatible nonetheless.
Yeah, the other part of that, I agree with everything that's said, is the master plan is developed by a committee, and there's not unanimity in the decisions during the committee. And at some point we give up fighting for a particular cause for the good of the group. So, you know, again, it's general. It's,
sometimes we'll have someone come forward from the community that has an idea about a land use that isn't consistent with a master plan, and it doesn't get to you until we first have sat back and looked at it and said, you know, they brought up a good point. The trends in land use are changing. Let's go back and do the micro area analysis, because either we want to find a place for that use, we want to find a different use category that might be appropriate for this neighborhood. There are reasons why we might not wait for the 5 years. And a lot of times it is initiated by a property owner that's got a good, an interesting idea. And sometimes you guys say, no, we don't want to look into that. And that's the end of the conversation. But it is a living document. And sometimes when somebody comes to us with something, the answer might be, not yet, we need to study it some more. And it is a living document.
All right.
So let's move on to standard 4. All special land uses shall provide facilities for safe and convenient vehicular and pedestrian traffic, including but not limited to turning movements, traffic flow, proximity in relationship to intersections, adequacy of site distances, location and access of off-street parking, and provisions for pedestrian traffic. And this is a standard that would definitely perhaps require a traffic impact report or analysis that decision makers might want or might be required by the zoning ordinance. But also this is often where your local knowledge comes into play, specifically that the traffic on these streets and on these areas as well as anybody else. I've been in many instances where there have been decision makers who said, what this traffic impact analysis provided by the applicant didn't take into mind is they said the peak hour was at 5 p.m. Peak hour is at 3 p.m. when the elementary school down the street lets out. And so they took that traffic study at the wrong time. And really, I would think for this type of standard, if you don't have the data that you feel that you need, that it's appropriate to ask for it. Does anybody have any questions or discussion?
And the issue of data really can go to many of these factors. It can actually go to your substantial injury factor, depending on what the quote unquote injury is. There's probably a consultant and an expert and some sort of environmental specialist that can help you evaluate it if it's that complicated. And if you feel you need that information to make a decision, then you can ask for it and postpone the matter to ask for it either by the applicant or the township.
So I've heard it said that, the road commission would require upgrades for a new development, and we have to assume that they're gonna manage it and make it right. I don't necessarily like having to rely on another governmental unit who doesn't live in this community. And when I look at a situation where there's an existing traffic, not really, it's kind of substandard. And I think, well, they're not going to make the developer fix the existing problem. They're going to make them address, maybe some turn lanes or whatever, but not correcting the overall issue that already is there.
So I think deferring to the road commission is primarily because they're the jurisdiction with authority over the roads. You don't have any say in it. You can write a letter, you can ask for the evaluation, but what you can do is ask for a traffic impact study, which will tell you the impact of that particular development on the existing traffic patterns. You would have difficulty reading a traffic impact study. You would then have to have them prepare a report analyzing it for you to tell you what it means. But then even in the end, what does that mean for you? You still have to rely on whether or not the road commission is going to make those accommodations. Can you deny it if it's a special land use? Can you make it a condition? Well, you can't make it a condition on the road commission doing something because you have no control over that. You can deny it because based on the evidence in front of you, i.e. the traffic impact study, yeah, you can, but you can't just say, I drive that road all the time and it's a hot mess. And I would want you to have that evidence in front of you of research that has been done to indicate that there's an issue. I've had this issue come up in other communities as it relates to the DEQ and wetland issues, where the DEQ decides whether you're encroaching on a wetland, how much you're encroaching on a wetland, whether you have to give land to compensate for filling any portion of the wetland. And so I see the same issue coming up, but then you get a wetland delineation report. You get an analysis from a consultant that helps you understand. Same thing. You can condition approval of a special land use on DEQ approval, but I don't know why you would want to approve it conditioned on something that may or may not happen. So I know I didn't answer your question. It's because it's a difficult question to answer, but depending on the situation, you may just have to defer to that regulatory agency.
Well, I would add to that what you said, that the road commission basically is around the perimeter. What this is specifically talking about is how do you like the site layout? If you have a heavy group of parking that's entering an employee entrance, and that's also the main drive coming into the parking lot, that's something that you want to try to avoid. And you want to try to encourage the applicant to find a safer way to get the employees into the building, that kind of thing. So as a civil engineer, I enjoy that part of site plan reviews because frankly, all too often the professionals that put together the drawings don't do a very good job of it. Or oftentimes the owner doesn't want to pay for a well-engineered site plan. And so it really does become the planning commission's job to try to convince the owner that he better get a better site engineer involved.
Yeah, I had a concern about that. We've talked about it off and on, but we don't have an image of what someone might want to put on the property. So how can we even make a decision on the impact? We don't even know what it looks like. We talk about site plan or some kind of site plan. So
You should not be approving a special land use without a site plan.
Yeah.
They should go hand in hand. You're approving the particular use in the particular plan.
Are we ready for standard 5?
Just one quick question on the site plan. So, but the planning commission approves the site plan, I thought, after the special use.
Yeah, so township board would approve the special land use permit subject to approval of the site plan as presented. Right? Because you're approving the special land use based on a plan that's in front of you.
Think about it more similarly to the way a subdivision comes together. You get a pre-plan. It's not fully, absolutely 100% engineered out. They haven't laid every single grade on every little piece of curb. They don't want to go to that effort if you're not even going to approve the use. But they should have enough thought into the plan that you can see the traffic circulation pattern, that you can get a sense of the scale and the bulk of the building. It may not be exactly the building that the architect designs eventually, but there should be enough concept there that you know where they're at in their thought process at that moment. And then if they go some other weird direction, their approval's void. They have to start over again.
So there is I'm sure you know, there's a difference between a site plan and an engineered design plan. And I think that's what we're talking about. You're going to have a preliminary site plan. It's going to have the layout. It's going to show you what's going to be where and the traffic, the parking circulation. You're not going to have all the detail, the engineering detail that ultimately your engineers are going to review. But you're going to have a site plan to approve that in your special land use is going to be subject to substantial conformance with that plan. So they can't deviate. They can add to it with the engineering detail.
And on that note, Joe was talking about not knowing what the facility is going to look like. Until you get an okay on whether you're even going to be able to do the project, you're most likely not going to get a picture of a building or anything like
Nick,
that.
Rick, a site plan basically lays out a typical how it might look. I don't care the facade, the color bricks, or the story. We need to see a kind of a site plan so we can see how it's going to operate. But
okay.
Yeah. You could also add conditions to your special land use approval if there are things in the site plan that you felt like needed to be there. So let's say maybe the movement of a driveway or the location of a parking spaces. Movement of the driveway really, that's the road commission. So I'm gonna ask for some grace to strike that. But where people are locating loading spaces or parking spaces, if you felt like it didn't work with the circulation and create a safe vehicular or pedestrian environment, then that could be a condition that is moved, and you then have the planning commission or your staff check that when the site plan comes in for approval. Does it make sense? All right. If I don't hear any other desire for discussion on 4, I'm going to move to 5. So that states all special land uses shall be designed, constructed, and operated in a manner that prevents detrimental impacts to surrounding properties such as noise, dust, fumes, smoke, air, water, odor, light, and or vibration. The special land use shall be designed, constructed, and operated in a manner that does not detract from the area's aesthetics.
Can we call that the kitchen sink?
I think you can call that the kitchen sink, but part of it is, again, designed, constructed, and operated, and then detrimental impacts to surrounding properties, and it lists the kitchen sink, but at the end there's a qualifier that it's designed and operated in a manner that doesn't detract from the area's aesthetics. So I think going back to Lisa, where you were saying in the one of the first ones we looked at, it's that primary one in the front of the sentence to look at, and then the last sentence is the secondary thing within the standard.
And I think, yeah, yep. The same. You can't take a sentence out of context. That standard is the standard as it's written with all of it together.
The question on 5, constructed and then operated. So after the we'll call it the business is established, it has an operating principles. If it deviates from their operation that creates any of the other distractions, there would be action taken on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also many communities, and I haven't been involved in a special land use here, but they'll have a development agreement with any special land use that then spells out very specifically what those operations are. And then, and then also what happens if someone's not held to them. That's important to have, because if the ownership transfers, then the development agreement should be recorded at the county and then come along with all the other title work that goes within the property when it's transferred. So that new ownership does not have the excuse of saying that they weren't aware. Okay. I've had some communities where it wasn't in their zoning ordinance, and then unless somebody was making sure that it happened, it didn't happen. And so a new property owner, it wasn't recorded at the county, the township had a copy. And so then they were out of compliance and asked to be in compliance.
So we do enter into development agreements with the developers, even of a site plan, not just a special land use. Now, when you put a condition on a special land use, for instance, you limit the hours of operation, it's right in the development agreement. But then later in the boilerplate of the development agreement, it will describe how they can request a change in the future. So sometimes you have a concern about some impact that you think might happen from this land use. They go into operation, you go, oh, well, maybe we were a little too worried about that. And they come in and say, hey, I've been behaving. Can I have a little relief? There's a way for them to negotiate a little more relief with the board. And sometimes they'll come back to the planning commission, but we do track that.
Anything else on item 5? Six, the proposed special land use shall not unreasonably burden the capacity of public services and or facilities. And public services and facilities are usually your infrastructure. So stormwater, water, police, fire. And again, those are things where you can ask for studies, you can ask for expert advice. Your fire chief, your police chief should be involved. Many communities where I work, sometimes they are routed and asked to provide input. No questions. Hearing no questions to the last one, which is really a catch-all. The proposed special land use shall comply with any specific standards set forth in Article 10, supplemental use regulations that are applicable to the use. So Section 10, Article 10 has all of your different land uses where there's supplemental rules and regulations. And so it just references those back, and that those have to be met as well.
Another good reason for you to do this.
Well, and then Article 10, there's other standards in there, and those typically then when that happens, those typically have another section in the review.
So just to give you some examples, adult daycare home, bed and breakfast establishments, contractors' yards, open storage. So some of these uses that may be a special land use in a particular district has their own special regulations. So they would have to comply with those special regulations.
We've had a lot of discussion along the way, but are there any general questions about this before we dive into some pointers on making effective decisions?
So I think the big hangups that we've had and the discussion we've had really revolved around public health, safety, welfare, and substantial injury. Those are even just by the words themselves, they're vague terms and they're hard to really pin down. But I do think it does come down to having the evidence, having the support, your own personal opinion about whether something is a substantial injury may weigh one way or another. But if you as a township have an engineer writing you a report that says it's not substantially injurious and here's why it's not, and then they go through an analysis that can help you really zero in on what the standard says. I used an example, and I want to just kind of go back to that composting example just to give you an idea. I once had a case where an individual was literally composting leaves. So he was getting waste haulers dropping off the yard waste to his residence, and he's composting the leaves. And it was, he wouldn't stop. He claimed right to Farm Act. So we actually had to initiate litigation. So we went to court. The judge in this case, it was an Oakland Circuit Court judge, went out to the property himself to see just how bad is this. He wrote in his opinion that the stank stuck on him and his clothes all day. He wrote like the words, the descriptors that he used was so utterly terrible that he would not want to live near this property. We had to go to court to get a judge to tell us that it was that bad. And so even if you have a consultant who's an expert in the field who writes you a report and says it is or is not substantially injurious, even if the planning commission has 3 hours of deliberation and decides it is or is not substantially injurious, even if the township board does the same thing and all of you say all of the same thing, and a court might disagree with that. And I just want to point out I give you that example to tell you, as long as you're doing your best to apply the standards and you have appropriate discussion and deliberation, you're not going to make a mistake. The idea is to put your collective thoughts and reach a decision.
So the key here is lose the heart and follow the facts.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
You have to.
You have to try. You have to try. You have to do your best.
I agree. You got to try. Just a quick, I came on the board pre-COVID, like 6 months before COVID. And I've been on both sides where I'm trying to get approval, and now I'm on this side, you know, and so you get to see both sides, you know, from both points. And what I was getting at with the heart thing is it's amazing when you've read all your facts and Beth has given us weeks worth of data and this and that, and then you come in here and you listen to certain people and you're like, man, I didn't think of that, or you know, it hits your heart. So it's hard to, you know.
I'll tell you the only other comparable difficult decision is on the ZBA and what is a practical difficulty. I mean, that's a highly litigated issue as well, because everybody in front of you is going to try to convince you that it's a practical difficulty, but there's a standard that has to be applied.
Not a hardship, a practical difficulty.
Well, and yeah, I've worked in dozens of communities, and I always have full admiration for every planning commissioner and every elected official, because you get up in front of your friends and your neighbors and make really hard decisions. And it's a tough job. And especially when you have a contentious issue, and special land uses usually are. But one of the things we wanted to take at least probably the last 10, 15 minutes of our time, and I hope that we can still do that. I see people getting a little antsy, is talking about making effective decisions and findings. So we talked about that a lot through our discussion. Yeah. So, so one of the things to do is to prepare. So especially planning commissioners, you should conduct your site visit. I'll leave it to Lisa to talk about ex parte contacts, but review materials. Again, if you don't have what you need, let Beth know, and she'll get it for you. Our whole goal, I know my goal as a planning consultant is to serve the elected and appointed officials who are making decisions to make sure you have the best information and all the information that you need. And those could be applications and plans, but also ordinance requirements. And then all of those folks are available for you to ask questions.
Having ex parte communication with applicants is just dangerous territory for a lot of reasons. Something can come.
I was gonna ask you guys about that. I've gotten away from that. Oh, we got mostly wonderful neighbors, right? As do most communities, but sometimes these issues are a little touchy. Sometimes feelings are involved. Sometimes folks are angry. I don't know if I'm sure you remember, Beth, but about 20 years ago, I came up with the bright idea that we got away from sometime thereafter. And I'm thinking about what you've got on this slide and how we could prepare ourselves better and interact with the community in a way that's maybe a little more disarming, right? And what I was talking about was I said, hey, Beth, 20 years ago, you know, we need IDs or something, because while we might know everybody knows Joe, everybody knows Rick, right? I'm just going to drive up to somebody's property and say, oh, no, I work for the township. So I think we probably, I don't know, Rick, might want to get back to some type of identification. Well, I'm here just to check out something you're telling us is probably good and reasonably sound, that we should be conducting site visits. Maybe not having that ex parte communication, but I still think that's a good idea that we might need to get back to, Rick. You know, and again, everybody knows you, everybody knows Ross, Joe, but it might be good to have an idea.
Use of the term site visit. Me personally, I serve on the planning commission in the city I live in. Sometimes I'll drive by just because I want to get a feel for where it's located, what's around it, the surrounding. I would never get out of my car and walk up to the door. I would never go up to the driveway. That's my personal feelings. I wouldn't want the homeowner to then come out and want to have interactions with me. So personally, I'm just going, if I'm doing a site visit, I'm literally going out. for example, we just had one which was a home occupation child daycare home in a residential neighborhood. And so I wanted to see where the house was, what's the driveway look like, is it on a boulevard, so those are the kind of things I look for. But
Well, I mean, I hear you, I agree, and depending on the situation, but this is Highland, I've lived here my whole life and I'm just an old dumb Marine, so I might do the opposite of what you're doing, but that's just me.
I think when you get in commercial situations, it makes total sense to do a broader inspection because one of mine is the old Isaiah Thomas saying, look up above. How often do we require or request people to do plantings underneath power lines? You know, we got perfect examples right over here in M59. Beautiful trees are going to get cut down because somebody didn't look up above, and no blame, but it's one of those things where you want to try and help people stave that off a little. So I think it pays for somebody to go look in reality, because you can look online and maybe Google, you know, streets, you can get a pretty decent effect, but there's nothing better than being able to look all the way around.
Another thing that we wanted to touch on were general meeting rules. And sometimes these are really hard when the public is very passionate about the subject. And this is more to your chairs, is that keep the order, to stay on subject. One thing that's really hard to do is eliminate misunderstanding of the outcomes, especially if you've had 2 or 3 motions that have bounced around or you're having disagreements. It's really important to make sure that everybody understands what you're voting on, repeating the motions back, making sure clarifying. If you're not sure, also to speak up and ask. Also looking to maintain fairness during deliberation. So again, those chairs, one of your jobs is to make sure that everybody has the time to speak and has an opportunity to share and to go through. And that's especially important during that deliberation process, as Lisa's talked a lot about, that it really needs to be documented, you know, what each member of the board and the planning commission feels, but also it's helpful to keep a degree of formality that with the comments coming through the chair. You all know each other well. This is a small community. But sometimes when those passions run high, that formality is good to have. And also as either township board members or planning commissioners, directing your comments through the chair rather than speaking to the audience, so that interaction doesn't start to get out of control, which it can happen really quickly. I think, I think everybody on the side has seen a meeting turn on a dime, and and so again, by everything going through that chair, that really helps. And then to deliberate in the open and express your opinions. And again, as we keep on saying, use those ordinance standards for decisions. When you get to making a decision, having motions that are detailed and state what's going on in that motion, it's who's made it, who seconded it, bringing it to the floor. There are things that are amendable and debatable. And then making sure that you know what those are and who did what.
I have some communities, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I have some communities that in that same report that's prepared by either the planning director or planning consultant, they actually have sample motions you could make. And they might have blanks in there where you fill in the reasons for certain things, but it's really a format that you can use that can assist you to make a more formalized motion. Something you can request if you go that route.
In terms of debates, again, the chair recognizes the speaker. It's really tempting sometimes to carry on those side conversations, especially when maybe you have a clarifying question and you know somebody on your right is a civil engineer and they could help you. But 9 times out of 10, somebody else on the board or commission might have that question, and somebody in the audience definitely does. So it's worthwhile to be a little vulnerable and to ask that question. and to get those things down, not only in paper, but to share them with the group. And then there's some common modifiers to the speaking order. Whoever's the maker of the motion should probably speak first in terms to kick off the deliberation. And it's kind of like in kindergarten, give everybody a chance. And then whoever wants to play with the Play-Doh second gets the second chance at it. Sometimes there's some of us who might dominate the conversation. And then there's some who also might need a little prodding to be part of it. But again, we want to emphasize that all decision makers should have a chance to be on the record. One of the things in debating is to stick to the subject. And that's also important if this is moving on beyond to court. To debate issues and not personalities. Often that's really difficult because you all have longstanding relationships with each other. Then also you can use, a lot of times we'll encourage our planning commissions and township boards to use formal speech when it's especially contentious issue, especially when addressing folks in the audience or your experts or each other. Sometimes I joke that a lot of people, I recognize my name is complicated because of the 3 M's. And a lot of times I'm referred to as Megan, and I will joke that I'm just so good at my job. I'm like Beyonce. You know, I don't know what you feel about that for every one of your colleagues on the boards. And you're the face of the township. And so by you giving respect to others, they give respect back to you. Anything? In terms of meeting etiquette, you're the face of the township. This is being recorded. Do you live stream or video record or audio record? So somebody at 3 a.m. can be listening to this. And that's your chance to make a first impression. Again, respecting each other and the public. It's really important to treat everyone fairly, not only in terms of that's just the nice thing to do, but also in terms of documenting things and how you've treated people. And that's things that if it goes to court, they're looking at. And also keeping the actions simple and understandable. You might get to a motion where you've got 5 things and it's getting really complicated. It might be worthwhile then to take a pause or take a recess, get something down, think about it, and then to come back for that maker of the motion for it to be a little simpler. Or to talk to your township attorney or someone or Beth at the time to say, okay, how do we make this simpler so we can make that decision? Delays. And Lisa, I will also throw it to you if you have anything to say on this. But it's appropriate for you to do it if the application is incomplete, if you really need a lot of changes. Sometimes the applicant might request a delay in writing. They may see the writing on the wall in terms of some other things and say, you know, we need more time. Or when the necessary information from an agency or the applicant hasn't been received. So let's say your traffic engineer hasn't gotten back to you about what their traffic study really means. It's not appropriate when another agency or permit can be handled as a matter of condition. So it wouldn't be appropriate to delay until the road commission gives their approval on a special land use, or that there's minor changes. So switching out a deciduous tree for an evergreen tree in order to meet the ordinance or something like that. Sometimes there is a temptation with delays to keep delaying and delaying and delaying. Actually, when you do that, you're putting yourself in a higher jeopardy. Motions. Phrase things very carefully. In your head, who you may be writing for is the judge that Lisa mentioned who would go out and inspect the compost. I think I've said this before, make sure everyone's clear on the motion. That motion should definitely reference sections of the ordinance and reports, all of which should be in your packet. I know I have one planning commissioner who's also a township trustee who pulls me aside every meeting before we start, and he has his motion in his notes, and he asked me to say, to double check with him that he's referencing all the right things in terms of the way he wants to phrase it. And also to know that for a special land use decision, you can impose conditions. And so those conditions should be clear and they should relate back to a standard and making sure that they're complying with that standard. In terms of motion must, should have that special land use and number. Site plan, there should be a site plan associated with it. They should have applied for a site plan as well. And so that site plan name and number attached to the special land use. The date of the plan, including the revision dates. I think, you know, Beth will tell you how many plans you usually have that are revised and resubmitted before, sometimes 3 or 4. So want to make sure that that is the proper date. The result, again, approved with conditions, denied, tabled, or postponed, depending on what you use. Your findings supporting the actions taken. And actually, there probably should be a finding for each of the 7 standards. If you were really, really being particular. Any conditions, if those have timetables, those should be there. And then who's going to verify the conditions? That can be really important. Is it staff? Does it go back to the planning commission? Who's that person?
Question.
Yes.
You're calling this motion must. These are all items not included in the motion. Or are they included in the motion?
They should be included in the motion.
That's for planning commission.
Well, I would say township board as well.
What's that?
A little more formal than we are, aren't they?
Yeah.
Listen.
So there's Robert's rules, there's Rick's rules. So
in an
just kidding.
in an ideal situation, all this information would be included in your motion. Is it going to make or break anything? Probably not. But it ensures that the approval goes with the exact plan that was approved. It ensures you go through all the factors in your analysis and articulating what you based your decision on as far as what factors, why the factors were met. And it indicates what the conditions are. Can we go back and kind of pull it out of the discussion? We could, but ideally, if it's all in the motion, it's cleaner.
So it seems to me that that information would be attached through reference to the document. So you don't have to repeat all of that stuff. They're going to be attached to the reference. In other words, if we say resolution number, blah, 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 all the stuff is with that generally in the packet. So it's attached. I'm just using but in the case of the stuff with the planning commission, that is presented to us in a packet that has the recommendations, you know, the findings and supportings and all those things. So there's no reason for at the board level to repeat all of that stuff if it's there. That's the question is there.
There is, because the board meeting minutes are going to be part of the record if we're in court. So the same standard applies to planning commission and township board.
So for 12 years, we've been making these doofus motions that are not complete and would not stand up in court.
They would stand up in court because oftentimes you would say for the reasons stated on the record, you would reference discussions made.
Well, that's pretty much what I'm saying.
Arguably that can help. It's cleaner if it's all in the motion. But like I said, if you're going to have a consultant prepare the report for you, the consultant can actually write up the motions in both affirmative and negative. If you want to approve, this is the motion that you should make. And then there could be blanks for specific things findings that you have to make that you can just kind of fill in and read it. Or the alternative motion that the consultant can put in there is if you want to deny, these are the things you should rely on. And there could be blanks in there for your analysis of those. So it can be made much simpler. I know it sounds like it's
No,
owners,
it's, I
but
think the scenario is that we probably are jamming things on a board agenda at too late a point in time to get adequate information. So that's something we probably have to look at.
Rick, the other thing is that the council is correct that if we're recording stuff, then if you don't speak it clearly, it's not being recorded. And it probably depends on the critical nature of a motion. If it's kind of a minor motion, not influencing lots of people, it may not be as much of a court issue. But if it's going to be something that is heavy, involving a lot of people, but I think we need to speak it out so it is recorded, because you're recording everything.
That's why these microphones are important.
Plus, this might be a question for Tammy. The only thing that shows up in the board's minutes is the motion. If you look at the planning commission meeting minutes, we're going to have 4 pages before we got to a motion, and you're going to be able to track the debate and the discussion and deliberations that took place. Sometimes it even says facts and findings, and they're laid out before the motion. But the only thing that shows up in the board's minutes is the motion.
Correct. And I'm wondering if it makes sense to consider turning this long drawn out motion into a resolution, prepared resolution where, the board members can just say, I move to approve this resolution.
so it's hard to do that because you have to go through all the factors and you won't know what those factors, you won't know the analysis of all those factors ahead of time, which is why I say the motion prepared in advance could say, lay the structure out for you, lay the standard, and then have a blank for you to insert why you find that factor has been met. And then the second factor, and then a blank for you to fill in so that it will help guide you. I mean, it can have the number and the name and the site plan and the date of the site plan and all the technical stuff in there, and then just leave those blanks for you to fill in how it applies.
Well, and that solves the problem. If it's all in the motion, then we don't need the discussion recorded.
Don't shoot the messenger. But on an appeal, for example, when you end up in an appeal situation, the appeal is decided just on the record. I can't submit anything else other than what's on the record. What's on the record? The agenda packet, the meeting minutes. That's what I submit. So a judge is going to look at that and make a decision as to whether or not we made our decision based on competent material, substantial evidence on the record. If the meeting minutes don't show that we deliberated, don't show the discussion, then I can't prove that based on the meeting minutes.
What if the minutes say we deliberated? So in, every class I've ever been to, every clerk class says that minutes are a record of what happened, not what was said. So that's my perspective. And maybe when it comes to planning matters, maybe that's different.
I do think particularly with special land uses, variances,
rezonings, plan unit developments. Those would be helpful.
Planning matters.
Yeah. I want to stress these are motion musts for special land uses or those plan unit developments, rezonings. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's every single motion that's taken by the board. It has to be at this level. So we've gone over conditions. Just want to stress on terms of general zoning principles, that right to control land use decisions is an absolute. There's the public and they have to be weighed against the rights of individuals. And I think the standards speak to that.
So I didn't think when Megan prepared this PowerPoint, that we would take as much time as we did going through the standards, which is great. She still has a good dozen slides, and they talk about just general zoning principles, and it's all in the substances in these slides. We're happy to go through them.
Page for it. Let's get it.
So, so the rights of the public have to be weighed against the rights of the individuals. So there's a reasonable use of the property, but there's also in the reasonable economic return. And you're weighing those, you're looking at those, and every case is different. And so you need to look at each case individually, especially with a special land use. And a lot of times that reasonable use of the property, that's every single use that's listed in the zoning ordinance for that zoning district. It's not just that particular special land use, which for the applicant, when they brought it to them, that's the use because they've chosen it and they've invested a lot of time and money to get here. And then what's that reasonable economic return? Also, at the same time, the zoning ordinance, and we said this a lot, has to be fair and reasonable. It can't be arbitrary. And so when you're making decisions, they need to be pegged back to standards or something in the zoning ordinance. It can't be just because we've got a lot of people here and they're upset. And then also in terms of general zoning principles is a good master plan is a good defense in zoning litigation. So as you're going through this master plan update right now, it needs to reflect what you want the township to be. And when you're looking at it, when drafts come to you, I would challenge you to think about it in these special land use decisions that you've been looking at. Does it give you enough in order to make those decisions, the decision maker? And also you're writing that master plan for the future use, because not every one of you is going to continue to serve on the planning commission or the township board. So the next person who sits in your seat, what should be in the master plan to tell them what's going on? Also, the zoning ordinances should not exclude otherwise lawful uses. There's a big temptation to say, we don't want any of this. And I'm going to pick on renewable energy right now because that seems to be the one that's coming up a lot. There are exceptions, and that's one of those places where state laws carved out certain exceptions. But you really should allow all of the uses. If you're not going to allow certain uses, you need to be able to prove why in the general region that use is being satisfied outside of your municipality, and you don't need to have it. In terms also of general zoning principles, that following a procedure really matters. And so looking at what's in the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and also in your local ordinance. Also, you have to require applicants to seek zoning relief to follow procedure. So there's some people who don't want to follow the procedure, right? But they do need to get a variance. And I think I've been to a planning commission meeting where somebody keeps coming and asking for the rules to be changed. And your staff does a great job of making sure people know what that proper procedure is. But also to deal with zoning issues in a prompt manner. Sometimes there might be a temptation that this person's just going to go away. And really they should be given an answer in the same amount of time that any other applicant would. Really want to stress, make sure all the decisions are being made in an open meeting. There might be times where you accidentally have a conversation with somebody about a case that's in front of you. If that happens, the best thing to do is to disclose it at the next meeting, at the beginning of that. And then also don't express an opinion on a pending decision until all the facts have been deliberated in an open meeting. And realize, again, as elected and appointed officials, your friends and your neighbors are going to ask you about this all the time. And you're in a difficult position, but the best thing to do is that it's in an open meeting and invite them to come to the meeting or to listen to the recording. finally, when making a decision, make sure it's supported by competent evidence. We've said that a lot, and to make a good record. That's the reason for the picture of all the sheets of paper. Experts will provide an invaluable service to that. And their expertise and guidance can be used. It's crucial during your decision-making process, but also if it goes to litigation. And whenever there's an issue that appears to be generating controversy, it's good to bring in those experts, especially your township attorney, early in the process, to make sure that you're dotting all your I's, crossing all your T's, you have that written record as you're going forward. All right. I had a question slide about that, but I just might blaze onto risk management unless there's any burning questions or discussion points. So you can't avoid litigation. It's going to happen, just like you can't avoid an argument with your spouse. Eventually, one will happen. You can manage that risk and liability, use consistent rules and procedures. And you should have those written down. I know the Planning Commission, you should also have bylaws, use them regularly. And you do a great job of telling the public what your usual procedure is by telling them, you know, you only have 3 minutes when you come up and speak. That's an example of those consistent rules and procedures. Treat everyone fairly and consistently. Conflicts of interest, again, small community, you know, a lot of people, you know, a lot of folks who come in front of you. Those conflicts of interests are really financial, and whether you can't be neutral. If you have any questions about whether you have a conflict of interest, talk to your staff, talk to your township attorney, and look at your rules and procedures and bylaws. Those should spell things out in terms of when you have that conflict of interest. And then those accurate and complete records are very, very important. For those conflict of interests, identify, you will have one if you're the applicant, if you're a relative of the applicant, if you're a business associate, if you have close ties. And sometimes if you have to ask, please consult your staff and your township attorney. When it happens, the procedure is you state the nature of the conflict. The applicant's my dad. Request to abstain from the discussion and voting. I'm requesting that I be excused from this. Must be approved by the body. So usually your rules or procedures, that there's a motion, there's a second, there's a vote. And then the minutes should reflect the abstention and reason. A lot of times what we also tell our clients, and what sometimes I've seen in rules or procedures, is that if you have a conflict, you should leave the room. Not just sit down from the dais, you should leave the room.
Good luck.
Yeah, because your physical presence can have an influence.
I say good luck because I can tell you how many times people actually will agree and leave the room.
Mm-hmm. So
I have one question for Lisa. In the past, there was a scenario where a couple of board members abstained from voting. My research into that was that you cannot abstain from voting. You have to vote unless the board approves it, like in a conflict of interest. You can't just say I abstain from voting.
You have to seek consent of the board.
Correct.
However, it gets complicated if the board doesn't give you the unanimous consent you need and you have a conflict of interest. So I've had situations where that has happened and the board member simply refuses to vote with or without the consent because the fear for the conflict was greater than the penalty for not having the board consent. But that's something that you'll have a lawyer in the room that can help guide you through the process. But generally speaking, yes, you have to have consent of the board.
Right.
So some general things, but they do apply to special land uses, is that the zoning must provide a reasonable use. So you may be making a decision where you're recommending or denying a special land use. One of the things to keep in mind is there a reasonable land use that is allowed in that zoning district for that property. The use does not need to be the most profitable. You'll hear highest and best use a lot. That's not your standard. That was nowhere in your standards for special land uses. Again, support your decisions with findings and based on those review standards, follow your procedures. Also know what you decided last month or last year might be different because the US Supreme Court comes out with decisions. They've been coming out with ones all this week. I don't think any of them dealt with land uses yet. But there's also Michigan State Attorney General opinions. There's state case law that happens all the time. It happens at the county circuit court, state level. So the state legislature passes new legislation that changes the rules for certain land uses. So know that the sands can shift, and what you knew last month may not be the same situation. And so, but you have experts there to help. And with that, I had the final slide for questions.
Nice
very
presentation.
Nice.
Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you very much. You now put the fear in, I think Tammy and I both.
It's as clear as mud, right?
It's worse than that. It seems so easy. Now it's gotten hard. So, all right. It's a planning commission meeting at this time. So Chris, fire up your microphone and.
You want us to vote? Oh. Yeah, motion to adjourn. Second.